The image that won't leave me is of a figure out in a field long after the corn had been cut down. The stalks were nothing but broken stubble, gray and sharp, and the air had that metallic smell it gets before the ground freezes. A shape stood alone near the far fence line, coat flapping just enough to make you think it was breathing when the wind pushed through. The sky was low and white that day, flattening the land, making the figure look like it had grown right up out of the soil instead of being set there by someone's hands. For the longest time I watched one small glint at the edge of its sleeve catch the afternoon light and wink steady as a heartbeat, then vanish whenever a cloud moved in front of the sun. There were no birds calling, no combines running, just the soft hiss of dry grass rubbing together. If you'd driven by, you might have thought you were looking at nothing more than an old scarecrow. I know better now, and that quiet little shimmer in the distance still wakes me up at night. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back before any of this was a story for anyone but us. My mother's world had shrunk down to a small brick house on a tree-lined street in Springfield, and the routines she used to keep herself from falling apart. Our neighborhood is the kind of place where you hear lawnmowers on Saturdays and the soft thump of newspaper bundles hitting driveways at dawn, where screen doors snap shut and porch lights click on at almost the same time every evening. In those weeks after my father died, the sounds around her stayed the same, but inside the house everything felt muffled, like someone had laid a blanket over her life. When I stopped by after work, I'd find her at the kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm coffee. The radio turned down low so the announcer's voice was more hum than words. The smell in the house was familiar. Old books, citrus cleaner, and the faint ghost of the aftershave my dad used to keep on the bathroom shelf. She moved slower than she used to, folding dish towels with careful hands, pausing in the hallway like she'd forgotten what room she was headed toward. On the surface, it all looked ordinary, but there was an emptiness in the way she stood at the sink and stared out over the small backyard, as if she expected to see a different house entirely when she blinked. Mom had been a librarian for more than 3 decades before she retired, and she never really left that world behind. Every room in the house had books stacked somewhere on shelves, on side tables, lined up in careful columns on the floor with a coaster on top to make it look intentional. When I'd come in, I'd hear the soft rustle of pages before I saw her, like the house breathed through paper. She'd be wrapped in one of Dad's old cardigans, curled into the corner of the sofa, reading with a yellow pencil tucked behind her ear. She tried to talk about normal things, what she'd heard on the local station. A neighbor's new dog, something she'd read in the paper about road construction on the south side of town, but her voice had a different texture to it. It was like someone had taken the color out and left only outline. I remember watching the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug round and round while the heater clicked on and blew that dry warmth through the vents, carrying the smell of dust that had settled there over summer. Most mornings, she kept a schedule you could set a clock by. She'd wake before the sun came up because she never could sleep past 5 and make herself oatmeal on the stove, even if she barely touched it. The kettle's whistle would carry down the hallway high and thin, and she'd move around in her slippers, the soles whispering against the linoleum. Later, she'd walk 2 blocks to the little grocery store on the corner, partly to pick up what she needed, but mostly, I think, just to feel the cold air on her face and hear other people's voices. The checker there, a young man who always wore a ball cap, would bag her groceries with more care than most, and she'd bring home apples and milk, and sometimes a single slice of cake from the bakery section. She'd tell me I just wanted something sweet, and then leave it untouched in the fridge until it dried out at the edges. The refrigerator's light, that soft white square in the dark kitchen, would shine on that little plate every time she opened the door, and she'd close it again as if she'd changed her mind. Our town moves slowly in the fall. By mid-October, the edge comes off the summer heat and the air in the evenings has a bite that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter. You hear school buses downshifting at the corners, tires crunching over leaves that have blown into the street. People drag their fire pits out, and the smell of wood smoke and grilled meat hangs low under the streetlights. My mother used to love that time of year. When I was a kid, she'd drive us out into the hills just to see the trees changing, rolling down the windows so we could feel the cool wind and smell the damp earth rising up from the ditches. After my father passed, she started talking about those drives again, not in a nostalgic way, but like she was trying to remember something specific that had happened out there just out of reach. I'd catch her looking west while she rinsed dishes, eyes unfocused as if the house on Maple Street was just a temporary stop, and the real destination was somewhere in those ridges and hollows beyond town. Eric handled his grief differently. My brother buried himself under cars and trucks at the shop where he worked, coming home with his hands blackened and the metallic tang of motor oil clinging to his clothes. When he visited Mom, he'd stand in the doorway, big shoulders filling the frame, trying to make jokes about the Cardinals or the price of gas. His laughter sounded too loud in that quiet living room, bouncing off the framed family photos that lined the walls. He and Mom had always had a softer sort of bond. Shared TV shows, late-night phone calls when I was away at college. But after Dad died, there was a stiffness between them. Something neither could quite reach across. One evening, I watched her reach out and straighten the collar of his work shirt fingertips, brushing the grease stains, and he flinched like he wasn't expecting to be touched. She dropped her hand right away, and the silence that followed was so thick I could hear the refrigerator motor humming in the kitchen. If you'd walked into her house back then, you might not have noticed anything terribly wrong. There were still fresh flowers in a vase on the dining room table, though they were usually carnations now instead of the roses Dad used to bring home. The TV played old crime reruns at a low volume in the background, the kind where every case wraps up neatly by the end of the hour. The lamp by her reading chair cast a warm amber circle on the carpet in the evenings. The thermostat clicked over at the same times every day, making the baseboards creak softly as the rooms warmed and cooled. But it was in the small hesitations that the cracks showed. The way she'd stand in front of the hall closet and open the door halfway, staring at the row of my father's jackets still hanging there, the smell of his cologne faint but present in the fabric. The way she'd forget why she'd walked into a room and stop, hands loose at her sides, her eyes going glassy for a few seconds before she pulled herself back with a little shake of her head. These moments slid past us, then tucked into the ordinary noise of grief so small we didn't understand how much they mattered. She talked a lot about getting herself organized, as she put it. It started with kitchen drawers and the hall linen closet, and then it spread to the books. I'd find little stacks on the coffee table, travel guides, trail maps, old nature books with worn covers that she'd culled from library sales years ago. Her handwriting appeared on sticky notes tucked between the pages, thin blue lines that read, "Fall colors, short walks, easy terrain." When she talked about it, her voice had a bit more shape to it, like planning gave her something solid to hold on to. One afternoon, while the ceiling fan ticked lazily above us and a neighbor's leaf blower droned 3 houses down, she slid a folded tourist pamphlet across the table toward me. The photograph on the front showed a creek winding through a corridor of trees, water shining silver under a canopy of red and gold leaves. I remember the glossy paper under my fingers, cool and smooth. "Your father always said we'd go back there in the fall," she murmured, eyes on the window instead of me. We never did. There were other small changes that rolled in that October. She started driving a little farther out of town on her errands, taking the long way just to see how the hills look, as she said. The smell of damp leaves followed her in when she came home, clinging to her coat and hair. She kept the radio tuned more often to the station that reported on trail conditions and river levels down around the parks. I'd hear the soft crackle of that AM frequency when I called her in the evenings, the announcer's voice fading in and out in the background like he was underwater. Once I came by and found her standing at the dining room table with a road atlas spread open, her fingertips moving slowly along a thin gray line that ran from Springfield down into the Ozark hills. The late afternoon light was slanting in through the blinds, striping her face in alternating bars of gold and shadow. She looked up at me with a faint, caught expression, like a child with her hand in the cookie jar, then smiled as if to say it was nothing. If there was a moment when I might have asked more questions, it was a Sunday evening not long before everything shifted. I'd brought over a pot of chili and some cornbread, and the house was filled with the comforting smell of tomatoes, cumin, and baking corn. The TV was off for once. We ate in the living room bowls balanced on our knees, the only sound the clink of spoons and the occasional hiss from the baseboard heater kicking on. She seemed lighter that night, telling me about a book she'd reread, an old mystery she'd recommended to a dozen patrons back when she was still at the library. While she talked, though, I noticed her gaze drift now and then to the front hall where a small overnight bag sat upright against the wall. It was one I recognized from their trips years ago, the zipper slightly worn, the handle polished from use. I asked her if she was going somewhere, my voice casual. She waved it off, saying she just liked to be prepared for anything. Like life was a fire drill she expected to be called into at any moment. The night air that evening had that sharp clearness you only get in mid-October, where you can smell dry leaves and distant chimney smoke as soon as you step outside. When I said goodbye at the door, she hugged me a little longer than usual. Her sweater was soft under my hands, and I felt how thin she'd gotten since the spring. "I'm fine, honey," she said when she pulled back as if I'd asked. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a steadiness in them that hadn't been there a month before. "I just need a little time to think, that's all." The porch light, with its slightly yellowed glass, threw a warm circle onto the concrete, catching the faint mist of our breaths in the cool air. I remember the sound of my shoes on her front walk, the crunch of tiny gravel under my heels, and the way the neighborhood looked so ordinary. Trash cans lined up neatly. A dog barking half-heartedly 3 houses down, someone's television laugh track, drifting out through a cracked window. I got into my car, shut the door, and the world went muffled for a second, just the soft ticking of my cooling engine and the low hum of the dashboard fan. When I glanced back toward her house before pulling away, the porch light was still on, burning brighter now against the deepening blue of the sky. She stood just inside the storm door, a pale outline behind the glass, one hand resting lightly on the frame. For a moment, I thought about backing up, going in again, asking her what she meant by time to think. Instead, I put the car in drive and rolled away headlights, sliding over the familiar curve of the street, while that little pool of yellow light stayed behind, hanging in the rearview mirror longer than it should have, until the road bent and I couldn't see her house at all. I remember the morning it all began to tilt, though at the time it barely registered as anything more than a slight change in the air. It was a Tuesday in late October, cool enough that my breath left thin trails when I stepped outside. The sky had that washed-out look it gets before the first real frost, and the wind coming off the hills smelled faintly of wet leaves and wood smoke. Nothing about the day hinted that anything was wrong. Not yet. I'd left for work early, locking my front door with the familiar click and hearing the dry rattle of acorns rolling across the pavement under a neighbor's car tires. My mother had said she might go for a drive and clear her head, which wasn't unusual then. She'd been restless, moving from room to room, as if something inside her wouldn't let her sit still. I didn't think much of it when she didn't answer my quick good morning call as I walked to my car. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels steady and dependable. I remember telling myself she was probably in the shower or folding laundry with the phone set down somewhere out of reach. Later that morning, between student meetings, I checked my phone and saw her voicemail notification still glowing. No reply. No text. I told myself she was running errands. Maybe she had stopped at that little grocery store she liked, where the automatic doors always hesitated before opening. Or maybe she was walking in one of the city parks, listening to the soft crunch of leaves under her sneakers. My mind filled in the picture the way daughters do, ordinary, harmless, reassuring. But a small, unwelcome thought slipped in. She never left her phone behind on purpose. It was her lifeline, her way of staying tethered to us after my father passed. I brushed the thought aside, focusing on paperwork and conversations with seniors trying to plan their futures. Still, every time the hallway quieted, I felt a little tug in my chest, a subtle tightening like the beginning of a storm you sense long before you see clouds gathering. By noon, the day had warmed into that mild southern Missouri autumn, soft sunlight, steady breeze, a few stubborn leaves spiraling down onto the school lawn. I called her again during my lunch hour. Straight to voicemail. I listened to the message she'd recorded months earlier. Her voice warm, but a little tired, and something about hearing it over and over started to feel wrong. I tried not to let worry take over. People run errands. Phones die. Plans shift. That's what I told myself. But by mid-afternoon, when my brother texted me out of the blue, "You heard from Mom today?" My stomach dropped. Eric rarely texted me during work unless something was weighing on him. I stared at the screen, the fluorescent lights humming above me, and suddenly the day felt colder than it had that morning. I left school a little early, telling the office I had a family situation. The drive across town felt longer than usual, the traffic lights too slow, each stop dragging my nerves tighter. The closer I got to her neighborhood, the more that quiet part of my mind whispered that something was off. There was a heaviness settling over me like fog thickening in the hollows. Her house looked peaceful when I pulled up porch light off curtains open just enough to let in the afternoon light. I walked up the front steps, hearing the soft creak of the third board, the one my father always meant to fix, but never did. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside the house held its usual mixture of lemon cleaner and old paper, but it felt still in a way that stopped me right there in the doorway. Her purse was on the hall table where she always left it. Her coat hung on the peg by the door. The overnight bag I'd noticed the week before was gone, but that could have meant anything. A drive, a short trip, a change she hadn't mentioned because she didn't want us to worry. Then I saw her phone on the kitchen counter, fully charged, face down, silent. I stood there with my hand hovering above it, feeling the coolness of the air from the open window drifting across my skin. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Outside, a dog barked once, sharply, then stopped. The whole house felt suspended, like something had been interrupted mid-breath. I called Eric. He answered on the first ring, his voice already tight. "She's not home either?" he asked. "No," I said quietly, staring at the still full kettle on the stovetop. "And her phone's here." That changed everything. My brother said he was coming right over, and while I waited, I moved slowly through the house, noticing things I might have overlooked on a calmer day. The half cup of coffee left on the table still faintly scented the thin layer of dust on the TV remote. The blinds shifted just slightly open, as if she'd looked outside before leaving. Her bedroom was tidy, bed made, quilt smoothed, a book face down on the nightstand with her reading glasses perched on top. It was all so normal, almost aggressively normal, which only made the silence feel louder. When Eric arrived, he barreled through the door with that heavy stride of his keys jingling against the denim of his pocket. The look on his face told me he'd already passed from worry to fear, though neither of us said the word out loud. He walked through the rooms the same way I had, touching the back of a chair, the cold metal of the faucet, the sweater folded neatly on the couch. His hand trembled when he picked up her phone. He asked me if she'd left a note. She hadn't. Mom was someone who left notes for everything, oven-off, buy-milk-feed neighbor's cat. The absence of one now felt like another missing piece. We checked the garage. Her car was gone. Maybe that should have eased our minds. It didn't. She hadn't told either of us she was going anywhere that morning. There was no message. No, I'll be home later. Nothing. By 5 o'clock, the sun had dipped behind the rooftops, leaving the street in that early evening half-light that always feels a little lonely. We decided to check the places she might have gone. The grocery store. Her favorite diner. The park where she sometimes sat on a bench and wrote in her notebook. The heater in Eric's truck rattled as we drove, blowing warm air that smelled faintly of engine oil and dust. The grocery clerk remembered her from earlier in the week, but hadn't seen her that day. The waitress at the diner shook her head, wiping down a counter that smelled faintly of coffee grounds and onions. At the park, the wind had picked up, pushing leaves across the asphalt in dry, skittering arcs. The benches were empty. We ended up driving south toward the highway because neither of us wanted to say the thing forming silently between us. The farther we drove, the more the town thinned out, fewer houses, more open stretches of fields and woods, the sky turning purple at the edges. We passed the turnoffs for back roads we'd taken as kids, places where the earth still smelled wild and unfettered. It was Eric who finally said it. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the sound of tires on pavement. What if she drove out toward the hills? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We both knew she'd been thinking about the Ozark trails again. Not in an alarming way. Just softly, quietly, like someone remembering an old road they used to walk. We checked the motel she'd stayed in years back during a library retreat, a small place off a 2-lane road where the neon sign buzzed faintly and flickered at the edges. The man behind the counter, thin white hair, combed back shirt buttoned to the throat, looked up with mild surprise when we asked if he'd seen her. He hadn't, but he recognized the description. "She sounds like the type who'd like the trails this time of year," he said. His voice had that gentle rasp older men get, as if softened by years of dust and conversation. There was a moment standing in that motel office with its warm lamplight and faint smell of old carpet when I felt a new kind of fear rise. Not sharp, but deep, like a well opening under my ribs. She could have gone anywhere. The hills spread out for miles in every direction, full of quiet hollows and forgotten paths. We drove back to her house in near silence. The first stars were just coming out, faint pinpricks behind a thin veil of clouds. When we turned onto Maple Street, her porch light was on. We hadn't left it that way. Eric parked, but didn't shut off the engine. The idol shook gently under our feet. The porch light cast a soft golden pool across the concrete, but beyond that, the yard looked darker than usual, as if the shadows had thickened while we were gone. A single leaf broke loose from the maple tree by the driveway and skated across the hood of the truck, tapping once against the windshield before falling away. I stepped out first. The air had cooled sharply, drying my throat. The crickets had gone quiet. Even the passing cars on the main road sounded distant, muted. I went up the steps, hearing that third board creak again, a familiar sound that somehow made everything feel more unreal. From inside the house, the phone started to ring. Once, twice. The sound echoed through the narrow hallway, thin and insistent. Eric moved quickly past me, unlocking the door with shaking fingers. He grabbed the phone on the second ring and brought it to his ear, his shoulders lifting with hope, then slowly falling. "It's the sheriff's office," he murmured, covering the receiver with his hand. His voice was tight, careful, almost hollow. The ringing stopped. The house was silent again, too silent. I stood there on the threshold, half inside, half out, the cool air brushing my back and the warm lamplight stretching toward me like a fragile thread. Outside, I heard the low rumble of an approaching engine on the street. A moment later, blue headlights swept across the front of the house, slow and deliberate, and a cruiser eased into our driveway. The gravel crackled under the tires. The engine turned off. A door opened with a soft, familiar thud, and a deputy stepped out, removing his hat before he started up the walk. The deputy who stepped onto my mother's porch that night spoke in a low, steady voice, the kind men use when they expect the news to rattle you. The porch light glowed in the cool air between us, catching the dust on his jacket and the faint silver at his temples. Behind him, the cruiser idled with a soft tremor, its headlights brushing across the yard, and the maple trunk like a quiet reminder that the world outside our worry was still turning. He asked a few questions when we'd last heard from her, what she'd taken with her, whether she'd mentioned plans to travel. His expression didn't shift much as we answered, but something in the way he pressed his lips together told me he was already thinking beyond the ordinary explanations. He radioed in a few minutes later, speaking in clipped, controlled sentences, and soon another patrol car rolled up, followed by a ranger truck from the county. The night had deepened by then. A cold layer of air settled close to the ground, carrying the faint metallic smell of distant rain. I felt my heart tighten each time a new pair of boots stepped across our walkway, each time a flashlight beam swept across the front windows. That was the moment it truly began the quiet handoff between private fear and an official search. The point when the worry inside our house spilled out onto the street and other people started carrying pieces of it for us. We gave the deputies a photograph of her, the one with her summer hat, and the soft smile she always wore when she didn't know the camera was there. One officer, a man with sand-colored hair and a soft drawl, studied it for a long time before slipping it into a clear evidence sleeve. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, not saying a word, just anchoring me for the few seconds it took to steady my breath. Eric paced back and forth near the mantle, hands on his hips, muttering under his breath as if arguing with a version of the world that still made sense. By dawn, they'd checked the nearby streets' motels along the highway and the small diners that opened early for hunters heading into the hills. The morning light came up pale and thin, washing the sky in a color somewhere between lavender and steel. I watched from the window as another ranger truck pulled up, a dog cage in the back rattling gently with each bump in the pavement. The air smelled like damp leaves and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. They asked us to follow them down to the ranger station near the entrance of the Ozarks trails. The parking lot was already filling pickups with muddy tires, SUVs with roof racks, volunteers stepping out with coffee thermoses and old boots that had seen years of rough paths. A search and rescue dog named Brandy paced in circles, her handler murmuring something into her ear while adjusting her harness. The air was cool enough that each breath drifted like faint smoke, and the gravel underfoot crunched with that brittle sound only October mornings seemed to make. When we reached the small clearing where the search would begin, the deputies unfolded a large topographical map across the hood of a ranger truck. I remember the papery rustle as the corners snapped in the wind. The map showed the ridges, hollows, and streams spidering across the hills lines I had driven past my whole life without ever really seeing. One of the rangers traced the road Mom would have taken if she drove out toward the Big Pine trailhead. Her car wasn't found along the access roads, he said, his voice steady but low. That doesn't mean she didn't park somewhere unusual. Eric clenched his jaw, nodding, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the cool air seep through the fabric of my sweater and settle along my spine. Everything around us felt too big, too quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath. The first team headed up the main trail, boots landing heavily on the packed dirt radios clipped to their shoulders, crackling faintly with static. I followed behind at a distance, not part of the official search, but unable to stand still. The trail smelled of wet soil and decaying leaves, and the early sunlight slipped in sideways through the thinning canopy, throwing long shadows that moved with the slightest breeze. I caught myself scanning the path for anything, an imprint, a scrap of fabric, a glint of something that shouldn't be there. A few hours into the morning, the dog picked up a scent near the trailhead. My heart lurched when her handler raised his hand to signal. Brandy moved with purpose at first, nose low, tail stiff, pulling against the leash. We followed at a careful pace as she led us deeper into the trees, the ground getting softer patches of moss bright against the darker soil. Then, just as suddenly as she'd found it, the trail vanished. The dog circled, whined low, then sat down, panting heavily. Her handler shook his head, slightly crouched beside her, and rubbed her neck in quiet consolation. I stared at the spot where she'd stopped. The air felt colder there, as if the shade carried a different temperature. For a moment I heard nothing but my own breathing and the distant murmur of water slipping over stones in a nearby creek. The rangers marked the location with orange tape, tying it to a branch that had already begun to dry and curl at the edges. We moved on. By late morning, teams had spread out across a grid, some checking old hunting paths. others climbing narrow ridges slick with fallen leaves. The sound of radios drifted in and out, short bursts of conversation codes exchanged the soft pop of static. A helicopter circled above, once the blades thudding in slow, rhythmic pulses, sending thin clouds of dust swirling along the trail. I watched it move in wide arcs, its shadow passing like a slow-moving stain across the forest floor. Every so often, a volunteer or deputy would call out that they'd found something, a footprint near a stream that turned out to be too large a dark scrap stuck on a branch that revealed itself to be nothing more than a decayed leaf. Each false alarm pulled at me, tightening the fear that had taken root in my chest. At the ranger station, word spread quickly. People gathered in small knots, whispering theories that hovered between hope and dread. An older man in camouflage said she might have slipped near one of the ravines. Those slopes get slick after a rain. A woman who ran the local bait shop wondered aloud whether Mom had tried to drive down one of the old service roads and gotten stuck. Someone else murmured about wildlife bears, loose cattle, even feral dogs. None of it sounded right to me. My mother wasn't reckless. She knew these hills. But grief can make you unpredictable in ways even your family can't anticipate. As the hours stretched on, the quiet weight of not knowing pressed down on all of us. The volunteers moved more slowly, fatigue setting into their steps. I watched people come back one by one, brushing dirt from their knees, wiping sweat from their brows with the sleeves of their shirts. A few sat on the tailgates of trucks, heads bowed, elbows on their thighs, radios resting silent beside them. Deputy Hall, a tall man with soft eyes who reminded me of one of my old teachers, came over to Eric and me with a careful expression. His uniform smelled faintly of pine and dust. "We're widening the search by a few miles," he said, "just to be safe." I nodded, though the word safe landed strangely in my ears. Nothing about the day felt safe. The trees around us seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. The wind picked up and carried with it the scent of distant rain, mixing with the earthy smell of disturbed soil. We walked partway down a service road with Hall, who explained the usual patterns of missing hikers, the places they tend to drift, how panic can pull someone downward or sideways instead of back toward the trail. But my mother wasn't a hiker, not in the true sense. She'd walked for peace, not for challenge. Hearing him speak in generalities made it harder, as though she were becoming just another case file instead of a person with a favorite diner and a half-finished book waiting on her nightstand. By mid-afternoon, a light drizzle began to fall, soft at first, then steady enough to leave small beads clinging to the sleeves of jackets and the tips of fallen leaves. The trails grew slick. Mud clung to boots. The smell of wet earth thickened. Still, the teams pressed on, calling out, checking hollows, pushing through brush. Each time a shout echoed faintly through the trees, I held my breath. Each time it faded into nothing, my shoulders sagged. Rumors drifted in from town, half-truths carried by worried neighbors. Some claimed they'd seen a woman matching her description near an old gas station 2 nights before. Others said a car like hers had been spotted near a back road closer to the ridge. None of it held up. The deputies checked each lead anyway, returning with mud on their boots and faint shakes of their heads. Late in the afternoon, a small group of us gathered around the hood of a ranger's truck where the map lay open again. The edges had curled from the damp. A thin mist hovered above the ground, softening the outlines of boots' tires and footprints in the dirt. A deputy traced a finger along the border of the grid they'd covered so far. "This whole section's clear," he murmured. His voice carried the weight of many hours and few answers. I leaned over the map, staring at the spaces still untouched, wide swaths of tangled brush creeks with steep banks, patches of old farmland slowly being reclaimed by the wild. The land looked endless in that moment, an intricate maze of paths and dead ends. Somewhere out there was the reason she hadn't come home. The sun was sliding toward the horizon when a faint call came over one of the radios. A short burst of static followed by a voice that sounded strained, almost winded. The ranger beside me straightened, turning the volume up with a slow twist of his fingers. The chatter around us quieted. The air seemed to hold still thick with the smell of wet leaves and diesel from an idling truck. The voice came again, clearer this time. "We found something," the ranger said, repeating the message softly, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment, just long enough for me to see that whatever lay ahead would change everything. The call over the radio came through as a thin, uneven burst of static, followed by a voice strained just enough to make every head lift. The ranger beside me turned the dial slowly, as if any sudden movement might change what he was hearing. The wind stirred at that exact moment, brushing cold against the back of my neck, carrying with it the scent of wet bark and churned soil. His eyes met mine for only a second, but the message was already clear in the way his shoulders stiffened. Something had shifted. Around us, conversations died out. Volunteers straightened from their tailgates, boots hitting the ground with soft thuds. The low murmur of radios filled the clearing. Short commands coordinates the clipped tones of men and women trying not to sound alarmed. I felt my pulse begin to thrum in my ears as the ranger repeated the location to the others. It was a place not far from an old cornfield that curved beside a road leading into Ellington, a stretch of land most people passed without noticing. The teams moved quickly, but not chaotically. Trucks rolled out in a small convoy, their tires grinding softly over gravel. I climbed into the passenger seat of a deputy's vehicle, hands trembling just enough that I kept them folded in my lap. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and dust. As we drove, the trees pressed closer to the road, their wet branches arching overhead like ribs in a great wooden cage. The sky had gone a dull silver, and even the birds had fallen quiet, leaving only the sound of the engine and my own uneven breathing. When we turned off onto a narrow service road, the land opened just enough to reveal the edge of the field. Rows of old corn stalks, now nothing more than brittle stubble, seemed to bend slightly under the weight of the wind. Parked ahead were 2 ranger trucks, their lights spinning slowly in muted flashes of red and blue that washed over the gray afternoon like distant lightning. A few volunteers stood to the side, their expressions drawn tight, their boots half sunk in the soft ground. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, the cold hit me hard. It carried the faint scent of damp canvas and earth turned up by heavy tires. A deputy approached, walking with measured strides, hands low at his sides, his face composed in that careful way officers use when they don't want to give away too much too soon. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he guided me toward the edge of the field, where a cluster of searchers had gathered. The closer we got, the thicker the air seemed. I heard the hushed rustle of jackets, the soft scrape of boots shifting in the muck, and somewhere ahead the low hum of a generator powering a portable light. I didn't know what I expected to find, maybe a piece of clothing, maybe her bag, maybe nothing at all. But the scene in front of me stopped me mid-step. A scarecrow stood in the last row of the field about 20 yards from the fence line. At first glance, it looked like the hundreds of others scattered across farms throughout the Ozarks, lean-frame old coat straw sticking from the sleeves. But something about the way the wind moved through it made the figure seem heavier than it should have been, as though whatever was beneath the clothes wasn't giving way the way straw would. The deputies had cordoned off the area with yellow tape that fluttered softly in the breeze, the movement barely noticeable unless you stared. One of the rangers raised his hand for the others to stand back. Another lifted the portable light closer, its glow spreading across the scarecrow's outline, revealing dark patches where the fabric clung awkwardly to the frame. The ground underneath it was darker, too, soil pressed down in a way that suggested weight over time. A forensic tech stepped forward, moving with slow, precise motions, the plastic of his gloves whispering as he adjusted them. He reached toward the scarecrow's coat and touched it gently, as though afraid it might collapse under his hand. Instead, it barely shifted. He tugged again, a bit more firmly. Something inside shifted with a sound that didn't belong to cloth or straw. A dry, papery crack like brittle branches breaking underfoot. My body went rigid. A cold wave rolled through me from the base of my spine to my fingertips. It felt as though the wind had stopped, though later I realized it was my own breath that had caught. The tech stepped back and exchanged a look with the deputy beside him. Then he pulled a small blade from his pocket and carefully sliced along the seam of the coat. The fabric parted slowly, reluctantly, fibers catching against each other as if trying to hold their secret a little longer. When the coat opened, the truth fell forward. Bones, white thin, wrapped in scraps of fabric that once might have been a shirt, shifted toward the light. A hand slipped out first, or what was left of one, the skin long gone. The fingers curled slightly in a way that made my knees buckle. A ring glinted on one of those fingers. A simple gold band dulled by time and weather, catching the lamplight in a soft, flickering shimmer. My legs wouldn't hold me. The world tilted, narrowing down to the shaking circle of light cast on the Scarecrow, the pale form emerging from inside it, the ring, her ring, catching the air for just a moment. Someone caught my arm before I hit the ground. I felt the warm weight of a jacket being draped around my shoulders, the fabric smelling of rain and cedar. Voices drifted around me, muffled and far away, but none of it felt real, not in a way my mind could grasp. A medic guided me toward the edge of the field. I remember the texture of the cold mud beneath my boots, the way my breath shuddered each time I exhaled, the faint tremor in my hands that no amount of pressure from Eric's palm could calm. My brother had arrived moments earlier, his face, pale lips pressed thin. He didn't ask questions. He just sat on the back bumper of a Ranger truck with me, rubbing slow circles on my shoulder as we waited for anyone to say something definitive. They didn't bring us closer again. But from where we sat, I could see the movement around the Scarecrow grow more purposeful, more clinical, more final. A tent went up around the figure, its canvas snapping in the rising wind. A generator clicked on, humming low. Rangers shifted in and out of the tent with slow, solemn steps, carrying evidence bags and tools wrapped in cloth. Time passed, strangely long minutes that felt like hours, broken only by the steady rhythm of the wind moving through the field. When the lead detective finally walked over his boots, leaving clear prints in the soft ground, he removed his hat before he spoke. His voice was gentle, careful, but the words carried the weight of the confirmation we already felt settling in our bones. It was her. The Scarecrow hadn't been a scarecrow at all. It had been a frame wooden poles wired together, and my mother's remains had been bound inside it, dressed in old clothes, positioned upright in that field for years, hidden in plain sight. The investigation shifted immediately, expanding beyond anything the search teams had imagined. More officers arrived, some from neighboring counties. Floodlights were set up along the edges of the field, illuminating the rows like a theater stage. The air grew thick with the smell of diesel-damp earth and the cold tang of metal as forensic equipment was unloaded. As they worked, a quiet settled over the place, not peaceful but heavy, like the land itself understood what had been found. Even the volunteers who'd been talking earlier now stood with hands in their pockets, heads bowed slightly as though afraid to disrupt the fragile balance of the moment. At some point, a deputy led us to his vehicle and offered us water, though the bottle felt foreign in my hand and I didn't realize I hadn't taken a sip. Eric stood by the open door, jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle in his cheek fluttered. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scraped, raw. "We're going to find who did this." I believed him, but I also knew that whatever came next would unravel slowly, painfully in ways we were not prepared for. As night settled deeper, the lights in the field burned brighter, turning the scene into a stark island of activity in the dark Ozark landscape. A call came over the radio, something about securing evidence, something about notifying specialized units. The words blurred together, but the tone carried a new urgency. A doorway had opened, one that would not close again. A deputy stepped toward us, lifting a hand to catch our attention. "We need you both at the station," he said quietly. "It's going to be a long night." And with those few words, we stepped into the part of the story that no one ever wants to live, the part where grief sharpens into a hard, cold need for answers, and the world you once knew becomes a place you no longer recognize. The hours after they took us from that field moved in a way that still feels strange when I think back on it, slow in some moments, unbearably sharp in others. At the sheriff's office, bright overhead lights washed everything in a pale glow that made the walls look colder than they were. The scent of burnt coffee lingered near the reception desk, and the floors carried the faint squeak of damp boots from officers coming in out of the drizzle. Eric and I sat side by side in a small conference room, our jackets still damp from the field. The heat in the vents clicked on and off, blowing air that smelled faintly of dust and metal. Detectives came and went in steady rhythms, their voices low, their steps cautious. They asked questions again, some we'd already answered hours earlier, but they asked them gently, as if afraid to stir anything more inside us. I remember nodding a lot, my throat tight, my hands wrapped around a paper cup that had gone lukewarm in minutes. Every detail they shared about the scene, even the simple phrasing they used, felt like it dropped into a deep well inside me. A place where nothing echoed, nothing floated back up. Word spread through town faster than I expected. By the time we stepped outside to catch our breath, the rain had eased into a mist, and a small group had gathered near the station, murmuring in hushed tones. Some held their hands over their mouths. Others simply watched us with soft eyes the way people do when there's nothing they can offer except their presence. Springfield is large enough that strangers pass each other without notice, but on nights like that, the town shrinks into something small, tender, and aching. The investigation moved quickly once they secured the field. Deputies and crime scene technicians combed the area under bright floodlights that turned the night sky a pale, artificial gray. They found traces of old wire bits of weather-beaten cloth and tool marks on the wooden frame that had held her. When they brought in specialists from St. Louis, the tone in the room shifted. The talk went from what happened to who did this, and then abruptly to he's been on our radar before. The name they gave us, Earl Maddox 66, belonged to a man who lived alone in a sagging house on the outskirts of the county, a recluse known by a handful of neighbors and ignored by most. He'd been questioned years earlier after a dispute with campers. Nothing came of it then. But the more the detectives dug, the more threads began to connect missing older folks from nearby counties, old farm properties he'd had access to, and notes he'd written in journals they pulled from his workshop. What struck me later, when I had the strength to listen through the full briefing, was how ordinary the pattern seemed from a distance. Isolated areas. People who moved quietly through the world. A man convinced he was restoring something by taking what wasn't his to take. But inside those sterile sentences were lives undone, families left with empty spaces at their tables. And at the center of it, my mother turned into something she was never meant to be. The day they arrested him is one I still replay in slow motion. Officers approached his property just after dawn. Frost clung to the grass, shining in the early light like thousands of tiny mirrors. According to the detective who later told us, Maddox came to the door without hesitation. Hands, visible expression. Calm. He talked freely the way someone might explain a craft he'd practiced for years. Not bragging, not apologizing, just explaining. Hearing that made something inside me go rigid. I didn't want to picture him standing in his doorway while the morning warmed his boots. I didn't want to imagine him driving past the same fields my family has driven past for generations. But once those images settle in your mind, they don't leave. They linger in the corners of places you used to feel safe. The trial came the following year. By then, winter had softened into early spring. The courthouse lawn grew patchy grass, and the trees along the sidewalk were tipped with small green buds. Inside, though, the air was tight and still, carrying the faint smell of old wood polish and the harsh brightness of fluorescent lights. Eric sat beside me during every hearing. He kept his hands clasped the whole time, knuckles turning white whenever the evidence was introduced. The prosecutors laid out the details with quiet precision photographs. journals, maps marked with neat red symbols. They showed us how he chose his victims, how he built the frames, how he moved through the land as if no one was watching. Maddox rarely looked our way. When he did, it was with an expression that unsettled me. Not anger, not fear, just a sort of calm curiosity, as though our grief was another detail in his private order of the world. I learned to turn my face away when I felt his eyes flicker in our direction. When the jury delivered the verdict guilty on all counts, there was no applause, no release of tension in the room. Just a long exhale from several people at once, like a gust of wind moving through a closed space. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. Even then, he didn't flinch. He only shifted slightly in his chair, as if settling himself for a long evening. After the sentencing reporters camped outside the courthouse, their voices too loud for a day that carried so much weight. We slipped out a side exit with a deputy guiding us to our cars. The sun was lowering along the tops of the buildings, washing the brick in a soft orange glow. In that light, everything looked too normal for what we'd just lived through. Life doesn't return to what it was after something like that. It reshapes itself around the absence, forming new routines in the spaces that opened when the old ones fell away. For months afterward, I'd catch myself reaching for the phone at times when I used to call her Sunday afternoon, early evening, while making dinner, the first hint of a storm rolling across the hills. The silence that followed those impulses landed heavy each time, like a hand pressing gently against my chest. Eric changed too. He worked longer hours, took fewer days off, and moved through life with a kind of determined quiet. But every so often I'd see him pause in a parking lot or at a traffic light, eyes drifting toward a patch of woods or an old barn leaning from age, and I knew he was thinking the same thing. I was that ordinary places hide more than we realize, and the land holds the memory of people long after we're gone. As for me, the world feels more fragile now. I find myself lingering on little details, the sound of wind brushing through dry leaves, the smell of rain on warm soil, the way early morning mist settles low over the fields near Ellington. Those places carry a different weight. They ask something of me I can't quite name. Maybe it's respect. Maybe it's caution. Maybe it's simply the understanding that loss can root itself anywhere, even in the softest stretches of land. My mother's gravesite sits beneath a large oak on the east side of the memorial park. It's a quiet spot where the breeze moves through the branches in a steady whisper, and the ground stays cool even in late summer. I visit often. Sometimes I bring flowers. Sometimes I just sit there listening to the wind shift through the leaves and letting the stillness settle around me. It's not peace, exactly, but it's a place where the sharpness of memory softens into something bearable. The field where she was found has grown over now. The new owner planted ryegrass, and in spring it waves in long green ribbons that catch the sun. People say the land forgets, but I don't think that's quite true. It changes, certainly. But every time I pass by, I feel a low hum in the air, as if the earth itself remembers the weight it once carried. There is one image I still see at night, sometimes the faint glint of her ring catching the edge of a floodlight, trembling in the cold wind as if trying to speak. It's not a frightening image. Just a reminder that even in silence, some truths continue to shine. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.